With how game-changing evolutions are to Clash Royale, you would expect that every evolution that has ever existed in Clash Royale would be extremely strong in their own way, or at least somewhat stronger than normal cards. But throughout their existence within Clash Royale, it is clear that some evolutions have been consistently worse than others, and sometimes just straight up worse than their normal card version. That's why in this video, I wanted to look at some of the worst evolutions to find out what truly is the worst evolution in Clash Royale history. I never thought I'd see the day where the Evo Zap is a dead card, but the September 2025 Evolved Zap is probably one of the worst evolutions in the game, and I guess that just goes to show how terrible this meta is if a versatile spell like the Zap and its evolution have been rendered useless. A big reason the Evo Zap was so good is because it can take out cards that previously only arrows could reliably take out, like the Firecracker and the Archers. On top of that, the Evo Zap could also stun troops, which could reset the attack of some cards, and the Zap was also a cheap way to take out swarm cards. However, the versatility of the Vine spell has made the Zap spell basically irrelevant. Not only can the Vines do exactly what the Evo Zap can, it can also stun troops for longer, and also bring air troops to the ground, which allows for unique interactions. But most important of all, it's just a regular card rather than an evolution, which means you don't need to cycle to it like you do with the Evo Zap.
I never ever see Zap spell anymore. Honestly, like, just because of the meta, I would really kind of have to put this in the F tier. I think Evo Zap is up there for one of the worst evolutions right now. It's literally only used in Lava Hound, and even in Lava Hound, it's getting replaced by the arrows and the Vine spell. If it was any other meta, I'd probably put it average or maybe a little bit below average, but in this season, it's honestly just unusable.
To be honest, the Vine spell is literally just an evolved version of the Evo Zap, which is so crazy to think about. I don't think the Evo Zap is a bad card stat-wise, it's just that the current meta is horrible for the card. In top ladder, the Evo Zap has consistently sat at a 2% usage rate, while the normal Zap has sat at around a 5 to 6% usage rate. It is also one of the worst small spells in the game at the moment, down there with the Goblin Curse and the normal Snowball. Comparing this to what it was literally a month ago in August 2025, we see that the Evo Zap was sitting at around a 9 to 10% usage rate in competitive play, which makes sense for an evolved small spell. The September 2025 Evo Zap has to be one of the worst states an evolution has ever been in, and I feel like that just goes to show how game-changing evolutions are, if such a strong card can be considered bad relative to other evolutions. The current day Evo Snowball is a good balance of strength without being too overpowered, but I feel like the release Evo Snowball, which was the December 2024 to January 2025 version of the Evo Snowball, was one of the worst evolutions on release. Now, before I get comments about this, I am not saying that the Evo Snowball was a bad evolution on release. I actually think it's an amazingly designed Evo concept, and I want Clash Royale to keep making evolutions like this. It's just that compared to the other evolutions in the game at the time, the Evo Snowball wasn't even close in terms of strength. Compared to the current day Evo Snowball, it had a smaller rolling distance and only slowed troops for about 3 seconds rather than 4 seconds. I feel like a lot of these quote-unquote bad Evos are only really bad because the meta just doesn't work out for them, and the Evo Snowball was kind of in that position. December 2024 to January 2025 was a pretty bad time for cheap cycle cards, unless you specifically played some variation of Hog or Piggy's EQ, which the Snowball wasn't used in at all. This is mainly because of the popularity of cards like the Goblinstein and the Royal Chef, which made cards like the Evo Goblin Giant and the Evo P.E.K.K.A popular. One of the big issues was that there were too many strong evolutions in the meta, so it made the Evo Snowball comparatively worse, and also, the meta just wasn't suited for it, even though it was amazing on defense. The only decks the Evo Snowball worked well in were drill decks, and maybe Graveyard, both of which weren't that popular in the meta. The Evo Snowball was the worst evolution in the game in January 2025, being present in only 1% of Grand Challenge decks, and none of the top 10 decks of December 2023 used the Evo Snowball. And I want to be clear when I say that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, since I still think the Evo Snowball is one of the best designed evolutions. It's just that it was on the weaker side when it was released, and the meta it was introduced into was terrible for cycle and drill decks. This one is going to be pretty controversial, but the September 2025 Evolved Bats have just been made irrelevant, and I genuinely think they are in one of the worst states for an evolution in Clash Royale. The main reason for the Evo Bats basically becoming irrelevant is because of how strong the minions are in the current meta. The reason the Evo Bats were so good before the minions were buffed is because they were basically like the minions, since they could heal up and survive multiple shots from the Princess Tower, except they were 2 elixir and could have a higher total DPS than the minions. However, since the minions got a range buff, it kind of makes the Evo Bats irrelevant. The minions aren't as squishy as the bats, since they don't need to attack something to gain the health boost like the bats do, which means that there was kind of no point in using the Evo Bats if the minions can do what they can and do it better. And on top of that, since the minions don't need to occupy an Evo slot, it means that you can use the minions alongside another broken evolution. The Evo Bats have consistently recorded a 1% usage rate in competitive play in September 2025, while the normal Bats sits at a usage rate of around 5%. And before the minions became strong, the Evo Bats would sit at a healthy usage rate of around 5 to 6%, which shows the impact that the meta can have on an honestly pretty good evolution. So even though I don't think the Evo Bats is necessarily bad, I think that the combination of the current meta being more beatdown oriented, combined with how strong the minions are, makes the Bats one of the worst evolutions in Clash Royale. The Evolved Hunter was an okay evolution concept, to be honest, and I think Clash Royale kind of executed it correctly, but I feel like the nerf he got in June 2025, combined with the fact that the current meta is so bad for the Evo Hunter, makes the September 2025 Evo Hunter one of the worst evolutions of all time. To start, he is extremely easy to counter, because his net only hits 1 troop at a time, which means that he can be easily countered on offense, since a swarm card can be used to soak the net. He also moves really slowly and attacks pretty slow, meaning that he can be easily taken out by cycle cards. And considering that the hunter attacks slower than the time it takes for spirits to jump onto him, it also makes him terrible, since the Furnace and Evo Furnace are so popular. On top of that, most of the time, the hunter's net ability isn't really that useful, unless it's specifically going up against beatdown, or is paired along with support cards like the Fisherman. So at that point, it's not really worth cycling 2 hunters, which keep in mind isn't really a great base card in the current meta as well, since cheap cycle and spirits easily counter him. But then we get to the main reason the hunter is so terrible in this meta. The Vine spell literally does exactly what the hunter does, and it does it better because it does more than an arrow's worth of damage and can be placed anywhere in the arena. On top of that, the Vine spell isn't an evolution, which means it doesn't need to be cycled to like the hunter, and the Vines also doesn't occupy an Evo slot, which means that you can pair the Vine spell with a broken evolution, and you don't have to waste an Evo slot like you do with the hunter. While the Vines is a nice concept, it completely makes the Evo Hunter irrelevant, since it's better at literally everything. So not only is the September 2025 Hunter kind of weak in terms of his stats and playstyle, he has also been made useless by the Vine spell. I feel like the Evo Bomber has had one of the biggest fall-offs for an evolution in this game. It went from literally being top 2, if not the best evolution of all time in its first month, to being one of the worst evolutions in the game in its current state. Since its release, the Evolved Bomber has only ever been nerfed, and over time as it got nerfed more and more, it just became worse and worse. Its first nerf decreased the range of each bounce, which was kind of like a rework rather than a nerf, since this allowed him to more consistently get double bounces if he was aligned, but his overall range was lower. His second nerf increased the number of cycles, which was a massive nerf, since it meant that only every 3rd bomber would be evolved rather than every 2nd. But even that wasn't enough, since Clash Royale nerfed the normal bomber's damage slightly after that. And finally, they made it so that the Evo Bomber's bomb would never damage the same troop twice, even if its animation showed that it did. So since October 2024, the Evo Bomber has been pretty bad in competitive play, and considering the current meta, the Evo Bomber has become even worse, since Vines can kill it pretty easily, and it's also pretty predictable in competitive play. And even if you can't predict it, it's not as punishing as it used to be, since it doesn't double bounce and it's extremely difficult to line up, making it actually pretty skillful. For the past couple of months, the Bomber has sat at the bottom of the usage rate stats in competitive play, recording usage rates as low as 1% in competitive play. On the other hand, the normal Bomber sits at a balanced usage rate of about 6 to 7%, and the only reason the Evo Bomber is used in the decks that it is used in is because there are literally no other good Evos for drill decks other than the Evo Snowball, since Evo drill sucks. I wonder if Clash Royale will either retry with this card or leave it to fade into irrelevance to avoid it becoming the menace it once was, since I feel like making it a one-cycle Evo is not that bad of a buff for the card in its current state. So not only is the current meta not that great for the Evo Bomber, it's also just not as punishing and useful as it used to be, making the October 2024 to current day Evo Bomber one of the worst evolutions in Clash Royale history. 2023 was a crazy year for evolution releases, with it having probably the highest proportion of broken evolutions released in a small time frame, considering that evolutions only came out in the middle of the year. However, it seems that Clash Royale toned it down with the December 2023 evolved Ice Spirit. And yeah, I do admit that the Evo Ice Spirit was a pretty strong evolution later on in 2024 and 2025, but this was mostly because of Cycle being insanely strong during this time, but also because Clash Royale repeatedly gave it buffs during 2024. The main thing that made the December 2023 Evo Ice Spirit so terrible was the fact that it was 3 cycles. This meant that only every 4th Ice Spirit you played would be evolved, which was pretty terrible since its ability, although it was pretty strong on defense, just wasn't worth it to waste an Evo slot on.
The only thing, why is it 3 cycle?
Yeah, that's the problem. It is a fast cycle card, but man, 3 evolution cycles feels like it takes so long to get to full. Weren't the Skeletons 3 cycles initially, and then they changed this to 2?
Yeah. It was so bad.
Just to give you an idea, if we take an average elixir cost of a deck as 3 elixir, which is pretty generous, then it means that 4 card cycle is probably around 8 to 10 elixir. This means that a player would have to play at least 24 elixir to even cycle to the evolved Ice Spirit, and that's a bare minimum. This meant that in a game, you could probably only get 1 or 2 Evo Ice Spirits, which keep in mind would basically just serve the same purpose as a normal Ice Spirit, since the opponent would be able to build multiple pushes in the same time that it took you to only cycle once to your evolution. But what made things even worse was that during December 2023, you could only have 1 evolution in your deck, since this was before Clash Royale released the second Evo slot. Considering the other evolutions at the time, it was not worth handicapping yourself with a card that you could barely evolve, considering that cards like the Evo Recruits and the Evo Knight were not only better, but you could cycle to them faster. The issue with the December 2023 evolved Ice Spirit is that everything that could have gone wrong for it went wrong. It took too long to cycle, its ability felt quite situational, the other evolutions were so much better, and it didn't give the card a unique new ability like the other evolutions. During December 2023, Clash Royale buffed it so that it would be a 2-cycle Evo rather than a 3-cycle Evo. But even then, this change wasn't gonna help the Evo Ice Spirit do well in the meta, since there were way more issues with it than just the number of cycles it was. The Evo Ice Spirit would only record a 1% usage rate in Grand Challenges in January 2024. There aren't Grand Challenge stats for December 2023, since new Evos aren't available in Grand Challenges in their first month. But if we look at the top 10 decks of December 2023, none of them had the Evo Ice Spirit. And to make things worse, the normal Ice Spirit had above a 20% usage rate in Grand Challenges, and was present in 3 of the top 10 decks. The December 2023 Evolved Ice Spirit deserves its spot as one of the worst evolutions of all time. A lot of people thought that the Evolved Skeletons would be the most broken evolution of all time when they were released, since the concept seemed pretty good on paper. It's a 1 elixir cycle card that could theoretically infinitely multiply, which means that it can provide so much value. But the thing is, the Evolved Skeletons on release was actually one of the worst evolutions this game has ever seen. It suffered the same issue as the December 2023 Evolved Ice Spirit, which is kind of crazy since you would think that Clash Royale would learn from the Evo Skeletons when making the Evo Ice Spirit. Luckily, it seems that Clash Royale has learnt from the mistake of making 3 card cycle evolutions, since they haven't done it since the Evo Skeletons and the Evo Ice Spirit. But the reason I think the Evo Skellies was worse than the Evo Ice Spirit was because their ability was actually pretty underwhelming. A lot of the time you wouldn't even be able to use the Evo Skellies for what they were actually designed for, and a lot of the time they could just be spelled away pretty fast. The thing about the Evo Ice Spirit is that it could be used reactively, and the opponent really couldn't do anything once it connected. And considering that small spells are literally staples in all decks, the Evo Skellies literally never got a chance to thrive in the June and July 2023 meta. And to make things even worse for the Evo Skeletons, the Evo Firecracker and the Evo Royal Giant was so much better, since you could cycle to them faster and it didn't depend on specific interactions to do well like the Evo Skellies. They just worked in basically all decks and against all cards. Since you were only allowed one evolution in your deck, competitive players didn't really see the benefit in having a gimmicky card that only worked 1 out of 10 times, when they could just use an Evo Royal Giant or an Evo Firecracker and guarantee that they would get value more than 70% of the time.
Yes, he missed one! He missed one, freeze! Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Oh my god.
I think the Evo Skellies fit under the criteria of it's terrible for 90% of the time that it's used, but when it does well, it does extremely well. The Evolved Skeletons were used in none of the top 10 decks of June 2023, while normal skeletons were used in 4 of the top 10. And in July of 2023, when Clash Royale released the Evolved Mortar, it made Evo Skellies even less relevant, since the Evo Mortar was super strong as well. The June and July 2023 Evolved Skeletons will go down as one of the worst evolutions of all time, and it was only in August, almost 2 months later, that Clash Royale made the Evo Skellies 2 cycle. Only then did the Evo Skeletons become somewhat usable. The Evolved Goblin Drill was one of the best evolutions in the game when it released into Clash Royale. I talked about this in my video of the strongest cards, but it is genuinely impossible for Clash Royale to balance out this mess of a card, since its ability is way too game breaking. So rather than keeping the card strong forever, Clash Royale decided the best thing to do was to destroy the Evo and give up on balancing it, much like the Rune Giant and the Void. And it's fair enough. I know that the Evo Drill was a mistake from Supercell, but they can't just remove it from Clash Royale. And so, since the final nail in the coffin nerf in October 2024, the Evo Drill has been dead for basically a year since that nerf, with no balance changes to the card at all, despite its terrible usage in competitive play. The nerf they gave the card in October 2024 was to remove all the damage and knockback the drill did when it submerged after the first wave. They also added a spawn time for the spawned goblins after the drill popped back up. To compensate for these deadly nerfs, they added a single goblin to the second wave, which is so insane, since they basically killed the card and just slightly buffed it so it would still count as a rework rather than just being a straight up nerf. This made the Evo Drill immediately useless, since the best parts of it were either its knockback to troops as it resurfaced to let goblins connect to the tower, but also its damage, since it was like getting free chip damage on the tower every time it resurfaced. On top of that, the reason the drill was viable was because the goblins would instantly start attacking rather than having a delay. So basically, Clash Royale got rid of everything that made the Evo Drill good. This meant that at that point, you may as well have played the normal Goblin Drill, since there were much better evolutions that you could have used in drill decks like the Evo Bomber or the Evo Tesla. The Evo Drill is probably one of the only evolutions on this list that has been unviable for over a year, and Clash Royale really needs to come up with something creative to make the Evo Drill work without making it the strongest Evo in the game with a single balance change. From October 2024 to September 2025, the Evo Drill has recorded basically a 0% usage rate in competitive play, and I genuinely don't remember the last time I played against the Evolved Goblin Drill. Meanwhile, the normal Goblin Drill has had somewhat balanced usage rates, hovering from 2 to 4%, which in this meta is pretty crazy, since it's one of the most unbalanced phases this game has ever been in. So to summarize, the October 2024 and onward Evo Drill basically had everything that made it good stripped away from it, and it takes 2 cycles to evolve, meaning that at that point, you would have more success with the normal Goblin Drill plus a broken evolution to pair along with it, rather than wasting money and an Evo slot on a lose condition. The Evo Drill has to be the worst evolution in the game's entire history, and I doubt there is any contention to this. I hope you enjoyed this video though. Thanks for watching.